All right, and welcome back to class, guys. I know it's been a couple crazy weeks with the election, but we are actually going to start our next unit, which is the legislative branch. So to get started, we are going to be covering a couple key points. So if you want to click over to your modules, I'll go ahead and share my screen so you can see where we're at too as you follow along. So you want to click on modules, then you want to scroll down and you'll see the module for this week. It is Module 2, Lesson 3, Legislative Branch. Okay, so you want to go ahead and click on day 1. So today's lesson, we're going to be covering a couple things. First one is Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. Second thing is the Necessary and Proper Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. And we're going to do a case study of McCulloch v. Maryland with this. Next thing we're going to talk about is the Commerce Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. So these are our 3 talking points. I've also included in this week's lesson the notebook download. So if you want to go ahead and click on that, download the notebook for this week. In your notebook, I would go ahead and copy these 3 talking points and insert them in the notebook, okay? Because those are the big things that we're going to be kind of talking about today. So you can go ahead and do that. So to kind of get us started off is I have a short little video that kind of talks about Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. And after that, I want to kind of do just more of a whiteboard session to kind of discuss why Article 1 is so important when it comes to defining the powers of the legislative branch. So we'll go ahead and I will play that video. Tony, can you turn up my volume?
Of the U.S. Constitution. Hey, this is Kim from Khan Academy, and today I'm learning about Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. Article 1 is jam-packed with information about how our government is supposed to work, but principally what it does is create the legislative branch of government, which includes the House of Representatives and the Senate, which together comprise the Congress of the United States. Article 1 also tells us how people can get elected to those bodies and what powers Congress has. To learn more about Article 1, I talked to 2 constitutional experts. Ilya Somin is a professor of law at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University, whose research focuses on constitutional law, property law, and the study of popular political participation. Professor Heather Gerken is the dean of Yale Law School. She's a leading expert on constitutional law and election law, and her research focuses on federalism, diversity, and dissent.
Article 1 gives an enormous amount of power to the legislative branch, otherwise known as Congress, and it was designed specifically to overcome some of the problems that they'd seen under the Articles of Confederation.
The legislative power under the Articles of Confederation was pretty weak, in part because the Congress under the Confederate Articles didn't have the authority to directly tax the states. They also lacked a lot of other powers that were eventually given to Congress under the Constitution.
These were the things that really mattered. If you're building a young nation, you need to be able to do certain things in order to protect it, especially at that time when there were many, many other countries that were circling around wanting to grab land and power. And so the United States needed to defend itself in those early days.
Okay, so we all know today that our legislative branch is made up of the Senate and the House of Representatives, but it didn't have to be that way. So why was it that the framers settled on this 2-house structure for the legislative branch?
I think for several reasons. One is that it was a compromise between the small states and the large states. The large states, the ones that have a lot of population, wanted representation in Congress in accordance with population. Obviously, then the large states would get more representatives. The small states, on the other hand, were concerned that they would be dominated by the large states if that happened. So in the end, the compromise is you have one house, the House of Representatives, which is largely apportioned based on population, and one house, the Senate, which is apportioned based on each state having 2 votes, no matter how small or how large it is. A second reason why you end up with this structure is the influence of the British example. The British had both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and the House of Commons, of course, being more subject to popular pressure, while the House of Lords was this elite aristocracy, and the founders also wanted a combination of popular and elite power. And it was thought that the Senate would fill that elite role, in part because initially the senators were chosen by state legislatures rather than by the voters directly.
So the House of Representatives, which is based on districts, is supposed to represent you based on where you live. And the Senate, which is based on states, is supposed to allow, at that time, the state legislature to nominate 2 luminaries from the state to represent the state.
So yeah, for a long time, the senators were actually appointed, now they're elected.
Senators were appointed until the passage of the 17th Amendment, which amended Article 1, and that gave state legislatures a fair amount of influence over who went to the national government.
But it is also true that many states by that time already effectively had popular election of senators.
Really interesting. Okay, so you described the Senate as being kind of the American version of the House of Lords, a little bit more elite, a little less subject to popular opinion. How does that carry over into the Senate that we have today? How are its powers different from the House of Representatives?
It does have certainly different powers from the House in some respects. For example, it has the power to ratify treaties and to confirm appointments to the court and to the president's cabinet. So earlier this year, when Neil Gorsuch was appointed to the Supreme Court, he had to be confirmed by the Senate. Obviously, today, the senators are elected just like members of the House are, and I think they're every bit as partisan and almost as sensitive to public opinion as members of the House of Representatives. So the difference between the Senate and the House in that regard, maybe it hasn't completely disappeared, but it's certainly greatly diminished.
Okay, so there are certain powers that are reserved to the Senate. Are there particular powers that are reserved to the House of Representatives?
The House is important. You don't underestimate the importance of the House. I'll just say the House of Representatives, for example, is allowed to initiate impeachment proceedings against the president.
If the House votes in favor of impeachment, then the Senate holds a trial to determine whether the official in question gets convicted or not.
As a general matter, though, they're roughly co-equal. For the big, important things like passing legislation, you need both of them to work together.
So together, these 2 houses make up Congress. So how is Congress different from the executive branch or the judicial branch? What are its powers?
The way that the framers understood it was that each one would have their own job. So the judiciary obviously was there to judge disputes between people, to run the court system, etc. The executive was there to carry out the laws. And so the executive's job is to administer the law once it has been made. And of course, the legislature is there to legislate. So its main job was to make the law. And at the time, I will just tell you, everyone thought that the big gorilla in the room was Congress, that it would be by far the most powerful organization. The framers simply did not anticipate how powerful both the judiciary and the president would become over time.
So what happens if, for example, the Congress and the president don't get along?
Well, it happens quite a lot. The president could refuse to accept laws passed by Congress. He can veto them. In that event, Congress could only override it if 2/3 of both the House and the Senate voted to do so. Congress, on the other hand, can pressure the president in various ways. They can hold hearings investigating his conduct of various issues. They can defund agencies. of the executive branch whose job performance they don't like. They can refuse to confirm the president's appointees to various offices, and in extreme cases that have happened a couple of times in our history, Congress can even impeach the president, and if he gets convicted in the Senate, then he would be removed from office. This is what led to the resignation of Richard Nixon. The House of Representatives impeached him, and Nixon resigned before he could be tried in the Senate. President Andrew Johnson and President Bill Clinton were also both impeached. In both cases, the Senate ultimately acquitted them, but it was still a very painful time for both of those presidents.
So speaking of antagonistic relationships, I think one thing that's really come to dominate Congress is partisanship. To what extent did the Constitution anticipate this rise of parties and partisanship?
They actually knew about parties to some degree from the British experience, but they were very suspicious of them, and they hoped and perhaps expected that they wouldn't emerge in America to anything like the same extent that they had in Britain. But in actual fact, within a few years after the adoption of the Constitution, we already had the first party system, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, and partisan alignments have played a big role in Congress ever since then.
So even back then, there were rival interpretations of how the Constitution should be carried out and what kind of power the national government should wield. But they somehow thought, naively, I think, that the parties would disappear and that people would have allegiances to their state or to their region, but they wouldn't be have allegiance to a party. That broke down completely, almost immediately after the Constitution was written. That leads to a real problem these days, because most modern constitutions recognize that there will be two parties, that they will be in competition with one another, and that part of the job of the Constitution is to regulate that competition.
Would the founders have done anything differently? If they had known about parties and expected that they would play such a big role, it's hard to know for sure, but maybe they would have been less confident than some of them were that Congress would always stand up for its prerogatives against the president. When the president and Congress are of the same party, I think often Congress is inclined to overlook various presidential abuses.
If the reverse is true, things might be very difficult to do.
Exactly. I mean, the whole point about them needing to act, needing one another to act is really a problem if one side is antagonistic to the other side.
One other thing we see here in Article 1 is talking about kind of what the federal government does versus what the states do. So this is kind of the idea of federalism then. Could you tell us a little bit more just about what federalism is and how it's supposed to work?
So the way that we understand federalism back then was that there was a division of labor. The states would regulate things that were inside their territories and accorded to them in terms of responsibility. And the federal government would regulate everything that was accorded to it under the Constitution. The problem is, as Congress's power became more and more expansive, it ended up regulating the same areas that the states regulate.
So if the federal government and the states have a law on the same topic, who wins?
As long as it's passed properly by the federal government wins. So if there's a federal law and the state law is consistent with it, the state law is displaced.
Is there anything that might surprise the framers about how our Congress operates today?
When the framers created Article 1 and drafted it, they certainly expected that Congress would have more power under the Constitution than it did under the Articles of Confederation. But I don't think very many of them would have believed that Congress would ever be able to do things like forbid the growth of medical marijuana in your backyard, or regulate what kind of toilet you're allowed to have in your house, or for that matter, do something like the war on drugs, which forbids the possession of drugs throughout the country and the like. Originally, the power to regulate interstate commerce, which is the authority under which most of these things are done, it was at the time conceived of as a power for Congress to break down trade barriers between states and perhaps regulate the actual shipment or trade in goods and services across state lines. It was not until the 20th century, particularly after the New Deal, that Congress was able to start using this as a power to regulate nearly every aspect of human life that might, in some respect, affect the national economy. So that, I think, is a huge change.
I think what would really surprise the framers is how willing Congress has been to give up its own power. So Congress has given the president a lot of power because it's created administrative agencies with vaguely defined mandates that therefore allow the president to use his entire administrative agency apparatus to pursue his goals.
So we've learned that Article 1 of the Constitution establishes the legislative branch of U.S. government, which is made up of the Senate and the House of Representatives. These two bodies were created to balance popular power with elite power, since members of the House of Representatives were directly elected by the people, whereas senators were appointed by state legislatures. Although one major change is that senators are now elected as well, what might really surprise the framers about Congress today is how its power has evolved over time. On one hand, as Heather Gerken mentioned, the powers of the president and the Supreme Court have grown compared to the powers of Congress. But on the other hand, as Ilya Soman points out, the framers might be surprised at just how much of our lives Congress can regulate today. To learn more about Article 1, visit the National Constitution Center's Interactive Constitution and Khan Academy's resources on U.S. government and politics.
Tony, can you turn down the volume for me, buddy? Just for a sec. So one of the big ideas that kind of came from that video was really like, what does Article 1 do? Okay, and Article 1, what Article 1 does is it really defines the powers of Congress. We know that the Articles of Confederation was weak, and that the new Constitution specifically needed to address the powers when it came to the role of the legislative branch. Okay. The very first section of Article 1 really defines the type of legislative branch we have, and that is a bicameral legislation. The way our legislative branch is broken up to is we have two houses, an upper and a lower house with the Senate and the House of Representatives. And the reason we have these, two separate bodies was because this idea came from a compromise between the little states and the big states when it came to the division of power. Okay. So let's break it down and kind of talk about what does the House do? What does the Senate do? Through this bicameral legislation, we have two independent bodies, okay? The House, both of these bodies can really propose laws. So both bodies can make laws, okay? When it comes to lawmaking abilities in the House, all revenue generating bills must originate in the House. Another example is the House of Representatives is actually to kind of understand like why we have so many representatives is because it's really just the true voice of the people. If you're elected to the House of Representatives, you represent the people inside your district. You represent the people. Now, when it comes to the Senate, in the Senate, they have really more, some of the powers that they have kind of goes on to the idea of checks on the presidency or checks on the other branches. Okay, one of those checks would be Senate confirmation hearings. So if the president appoints any cabinet member, any justice or anything like that, it has to be approved by Senate. So one of the big things about the Senate and how it's different from the House is confirmation hearings. Okay. As well as in the Senate, the president of the Senate is the VP, the Vice President of the United States. The Senate, to be a senator, you're not really a representative of the people, but you're really a rep of the state. Any questions so far? Okay, so let's talk about this idea of impeachment, because I know this is something that has okay, so let's talk about impeachment, and then that'll kind of help us define what the role of the House is and of the Senate. During an impeachment, whether it is a Supreme Court justice or the President of the United States, okay, either one of those, if the impeachment process is to begin, the investigation starts in the House. Okay. Now, usually if the investigation finds that either the justice or the president is, guilty of wrongdoing, okay, then sometimes you'll hear that the president's been impeached. Okay, but really in the House of Representatives, the only power they have when it comes to impeachment is they investigate for wrongdoing. Okay. In the Senate, they actually conduct the trial for impeachment. Okay. When they're conducting the trial, the Vice President of the United States is no longer the President of the Senate. The President of the Senate during an impeachment process will be the Chief Supreme Court Justice. Any questions so far when it comes to the impeachment process between the House and the Senate? One other thing I wanted to kind of talk about was the checks and balances that are really kind of offered within Congress. So this idea of checks and balances in government was kind of, if you remember right, was kind of coined by the ideas of Charles de Montesquieu. Okay. With this idea, it's kind of a trifecta of government, with the executive branch being on top, legislative on one corner, and judicial on the other. With this is that one branch cannot become too powerful, that there is a system of checks in line to where that one branch of government won't become so powerful that it takes over the other two. Okay, so let's first talk about the checks the president has on Congress. One of the greatest checks that the president has on Congress is the power to veto. Okay, so Congress tries to pass a law, it passes both the House and the Senate, it goes all the way up to the president, and the president doesn't like it. He can initiate what's called the veto power. Okay, meaning he sends it back to Congress with certain stipulations that need to be done. Now, there's also a second type of veto. Okay, and this is called a pocket veto. Okay, in a pocket veto scenario, the bill gets passed and it goes all the way up to the presidency. Congress adjourns and the president holds on to that bill for 6 days. Okay, after those 6 days, if he hasn't signed the bill dies and cannot be reintroduced. Okay, those are the two different types of veto. A veto, kind of a veto, and a pocket veto. That's a check that the president has on the legislative branch and to really prevent them becoming so powerful. Okay. When it comes to legislative branch to executive branch, one check that they have is they can override the veto with a 2/3 majority. Another check that Congress has on the presidency is the impeachment power. Congress does have this power as well when it comes to the judiciary. Congress can impeach Supreme Court justices. Okay. A check that the judicial branch has on the legislative branch, okay, is they can deem laws unconstitutional. For example, Brown v. Board of Education overthrew most of your Jim Crow laws that the states were passing, as well as Plessy v. Ferguson. Okay, so cases can overturn laws. Okay, well, the legislative branch really wanting to pass that, and based off the idea the judicial branch has to follow the Constitution, a check that they have on the Supreme Court is the fact that they can amend the Constitution. Finally, let's talk about the executive branch, or the judicial to the executive. A check that the judicial branch has on the executive is the fact that the Supreme Court justice serves during, or is the president of the Senate during a impeachment hearing or an impeachment trial. Sorry. A check that the executive branch has on the judicial branch is the fact that the president appoints justices. Okay, so that's really kind of how the checks and balances work when it comes to our system of government. Are there any questions so far? Okay, so the next thing I wanted to kind of talk about is the necessary and proper clause. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. So what I want you to do is either open up your pocket constitution or go ahead and highlight it and do a quick Google search of it. It's Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. It's the very last clause in Section 8. Give you a couple seconds to get to it, and then we'll go ahead and read it. You got it, Mr. Potter? Go ahead and read it for us.
To make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution for the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by the Constitution of the United States for any requirement of court office therein.
Okay. Okay, so what does the necessary and proper clause mean? Well, what it does is to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper to carry execution any of the foregoing kind of listed powers inside the U.S. Constitution. So anything that's listed in Article 1 that really defines what Congress can and cannot do. For example, in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8, I believe it says Congress has the power to coin money. Okay, so this is an example. Congress has the power to create money, right, or set weights and standards. So what does this mean when it comes to the necessary and proper clause? Well, it doesn't clearly state in the U.S. Constitution that Congress has the power to create a national bank, right, or to create a bank. But can you coin money if you don't have a bank? Can you coin money if you don't have a place to really process that money? And the answer is no, you can't, right? So based off of this idea and this concept, Congress should have the power to create a national bank. And that kind of leads us into our case study of McCulloch v. Maryland. So I'm going to go ahead and play a short video, and then we'll kind of chat a little bit afterwards.
Can you, or your
Mr. Potter, can you turn it up for me?
state government tax the federal government? At the founding of our nation, this question was in hot dispute, and the 1819 Supreme Court case of McCulloch versus Maryland would help answer it. This case was the result of the founders grappling with the concept of federalism. What is federalism, you ask? Well, it's the idea that the federal government and state government share power, and when those powers are not clearly defined, it can cause disputes. Hence, the case of McCulloch versus Maryland. But to understand this case, we need to take a quick look at the history on the Bank of the United States. The creation of a national bank was one of the hottest issues at the founding of our country. Alexander Hamilton was pitted against Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. It was the founding father rivalry of the century. Hamilton supported the founding of a national bank for the purpose of controlling the nation's finances. Jefferson, on the other hand, opposed the national bank because he thought there was no authority in the Constitution to create one. Round one would go to Hamilton, as Congress chartered the first national bank in Philadelphia in 1791. The fight, however, was far from over. 20 years later, in 1811, Jefferson saw a victory as President James Madison and Congress refused to renew the bank's charter and let it die. This takes us to 1816 and the Supreme Court case, McCulloch versus Maryland. That year, a second national bank was created when President James Madison signed the bank back into law to deal with the debts America gained from the War of 1812. This thrust the issue of a national bank back into the center of the ring. This time, the bank set up shop in Maryland. In a strategic move, an attempt to exert control over the national bank, Jefferson's party, the Democratic Republican Party, which controlled the state of Maryland, decided to tax the national bank as it resided within its borders. Now, federal bank cashier James McCulloch refused to pay this tax. He didn't believe the states had the power to tax the national bank. Conversely, Maryland argued that it had the right to tax any business in their state. This brought into question whether the establishment of a national bank was constitutional in the first place. So, the important issue of balancing federal and state powers, or the principle of federalism, was taken to the Supreme Court. The court decided unanimously that Congress did have the authority to create a national bank. Chief Justice John Marshall, in writing the opinion for the court, highlighted that under the necessary and proper clause, Congress has the right to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. In other words, at the time, The court felt it was constitutional because the powers of the bank were related to several powers in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. The court also ruled that the state of Maryland could not tax the national government. This decision was made citing the supremacy clause in the Constitution, which makes federal law superior to state law. Marshall wrote, "The power to tax involves the power to destroy." Therefore, the federal government had the upper hand under the supremacy clause, which made a bank constitutionally created under the necessary and proper clause superior to state authority. This case further defined federalism within the United States, as the federal government gained more power from the court's decision. This case is important to understand, as our nation still faces many issues that deal with federalism and the necessary and proper clause. These include healthcare, the legalization of marijuana, the Second Amendment, immigration, and LGBT issues. For more information on this and many other important court cases throughout history, be sure to check out the other videos in our Homework Help series.
Okay, so the idea behind it is the necessary and proper clause, or Article 1. The necessary and proper clause really defines the powers of Congress and what they can and cannot do. The idea behind Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, is it expands the powers of the federal government. Opponents of the necessary and proper clause believe that it's too broad, that it almost like gives a blank check to what Congress can and cannot do. But over time that we have found that with the utilization of political parties and really how the House of Representatives is set up in the Senate, that when it comes to the legislative process or the bill making process to create new laws, it actually works out perfectly because it's such a laborious and a difficult process to pass a law that even though Congress has the power to pretty much do whatever they want, they kind of check themselves. Because remember, when a bill is started either in the House or the Senate, it must pass the House before it is sent over to the Senate, right? And if the Senate doesn't agree with something that the House hasn't done, House hasn't done, they can then send it back. So what happens is the House will then check the Senate and the Senate will then check the House to make sure that if we do pass a law, that law is best for the American people. Okay. Any questions when it comes to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, necessary and proper clause? Okay. Just have one more video where we're going to talk about the Commerce Clause, and we are finished up for the day.
In this video, we will discuss the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause is part of the United States Constitution, and it is a major source of Congress's power to pass laws. The Constitution assigns powers to the different branches of the federal government. Because of the Constitution, some power is assigned to the federal government, some power is reserved for the states, and some power is shared. The federal government's power to act must come from the Constitution. To pass a law, Congress needs authority or power from the Constitution. Without authority from the Constitution, the law is unconstitutional. Think about someone who wants to fly a jet. Before he can fly, he needs some sort of certification. And that certification provides him with the authority to fly. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the United States Constitution provides Congress with much of its authority to enact laws. This clause authorizes Congress to regulate commerce with foreign nations and between different states. Congress is empowered to regulate interstate commercial activity. This is often referred to as the Constitution's Interstate Commerce Clause. The Constitution also enables Congress to regulate commercial activity between the United States and other countries. This is commonly known as the International Commerce Clause. And together, the Interstate and International Commerce Clause are often just called the Commerce Clause. So Congress cannot pass just any law that it wants. The law must have a constitutional basis. So if Congress passes a law, we can ask whether the law is related to interstate or international commerce. For example, let's say Congress wanted to pass a law regarding truck safety. If Congress can show that this law is related to interstate commercial activity, then the law should be constitutional under the Commerce Clause. If you'd like to discuss the Commerce Clause or any other matter related to U.S. law,
Okay, so for the rest of class today, I kind of want to go over what the module is and how it's kind of designed. Mainly because this module and this lesson has a pretty big assignment in it, an assignment that's worth 91 points. So it is a very, very big assignment that'll really, affect your grade. So I kind of wanted to discuss a little bit about what this assignment is. So first off, I'll go back to Canvas and show you guys Canvas real quick. So in your modules, you will see for this lesson that we actually have 3 different days we're going to be talking about the legislative branch. We have day 1, where we're really just covering what Congress is, the powers of Congress, who's in charge of Congress. On each one of these little subpages, I don't want you to write a novel, okay? Just go through them and jot down a couple notes from each one of the videos, as well as some of the readings. If it's bold or it's highlighted, those are probably important concepts that you need to know, okay? Day 2, we're going to kind of talk about the legislative branch in action. So some of the bills and how a bill is getting passed. And day 3, we're going to kind of continue that idea and how a bill becomes a law. You do have 2 assignments that kind of go along with this module and 1 quiz. The quiz will be on day 2, but on day 3, I want to kind of talk about this Article 1 assignment. This is your big assignment that needs to be done, okay? On your Article 1 assignment, you'll be working in groups. You'll be analyzing Article 1 of the Constitution. So you're going to be actually going through and reading Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. You'll be working as Congress trying to get a bill out before the end of congressional session. So I'm going to be acting as the President of the United States, and I need that bill done before we end congressional session. So when does congressional session end? The date for the congressional session to end is November 24th. That is the day before we leave for break. So you need to have this assignment done the 24th at midnight, okay? That is when congressional session ends. So you need to have this big assignment done before then, okay? If you don't, one of the big things behind it, I usually don't deduct points on assignments unless they are late after the unit test. But for this assignment, I'm making an exception. If you are late on this assignment, you will receive 20% deduction for every day that you are late. Okay, so after 5 days, just like how the president can issue a pocket veto, the bill will die. You're going to be kind of creating a bill based off your readings of Article 1, okay? You will get 1 full class period to really work on this. So I'm dedicating about 30 minutes, 15 to 30 minutes for every class. So it'll equal up to 1 full class period to do this assignment. The big idea behind it is you need to work together to get this done. Now, if you are a legislator from a state and you want to pass a bill, is it really hard and difficult to do it by yourself? Yes, it is. But if you work in groups and you do it together, or if you work in Congress and everybody in Congress agrees to, this bill becomes a lot easier to get past. So that's basically the concept behind this assignment. Okay. Working groups of your choosing. I don't care who's in your group or the number of people in your group. I just want you to get this assignment done. Okay. So let's go ahead and take a look at what the assignment entails. So go ahead and click on Article 1 assignment. You're going to make a copy. And I made this assignment on Google Slides because it includes 91 questions. Okay. For this assignment, you're going to be using Article 1 of the Constitution. So you can use your Pocket Constitution, or if you go through this assignment, you will see on the pages that I have linked to the U.S. Constitution, each article in the Constitution. Okay. You're going to go through and you're going to answer all of these questions. Like I said, I want you to work in groups on this. If you do this by yourself, it's going to be really difficult to do. But if you work together, this becomes easy, just like in Congress, right? If you draft a bill and you do the bill by yourself and you try to push it through committee, it becomes really difficult. But if you work together with other representatives and other senators, the bill becomes a lot easier over time. So I want you to work together. So what you'll do to kind of submit your answers is you'll just kind of click on each individual where it says answer text here. Look at the question. Okay, so what kind of powers does the Constitution grant to Congress? And you're just going to write your answer. So I'm going to look up in my Pocket Constitution and find in Article 1, Section 1, that the very first statement is that all legislative powers, so all lawmaking powers, okay. And you're going to kind of go through and read Article 1 and just answer these questions. These questions correlate with each section of Article 1. Okay. If there's any questions or concerns, or if you're kind of lost on the assignment, please let me know. But other than that, you are free to go ahead and get started. Go through the module, jot down a couple notes from all the subpages. And if you want to get started on the Article 1 assignment, you can do that as well. So have a great day.